I think I got interested in my family tree probably when I was maybe about 17, 18, because it wasn't something that was discussed very much, and especially German immigration wasn't something that came up much. I knew some bare facts, and I knew that some German people immigrated to Greenock. But with the sort of passing of the older generation, who found it quite almost a no-go topic because of the events of the 20th century and the two wars, it wasn't something that came up. But as time went by and I got older, my generation, my brother and things like that, got interested in the topic and decided it'd be worth looking into, especially with the advent of the internet and things like that. It made it a lot easier. My ancestors came from a village called Lemwerder, which is just a few miles outside Bremen in northern Germany, and they immigrated here in 1860 to Greenock, and they came initially to work in the sugar refinery business. Germany back at that time was very, very much like Ireland, in the sense that it was very rural. Most of the work was farm work, and it was quite a poor part of Europe at the time. It suffered from a massive cholera outbreak at that time, and it also had potato blight, again similar to Ireland. It also had very, very strong links with Britain at that time. The electors of Hanover, who were essentially the royal family for that part of Germany, were also the British royal family at that time. The House of Hanover was the ruling family at that time, so there was strong links. There had been a lot of Germans serving in the British Armed Forces for 300 years previous to that, but like most immigrants, they came looking for employment, and the opportunities were there because it was Germans who ran the sugar refinery in Britain at that time. So they were essentially bringing their own workers, again as you would see today with immigration. Mark Kuhl developed sugar refining in Germany, along with a guy called Lear Vrede, and they opened the first sugar warehouses at Sugar House Lane in Greenock, and a couple of the other refineries, and just brought that expertise. And again, naturally with that, they decided to bring over their own workers. We think that the maximum ethnic Germans peaked probably around about 1900, and there might have been up to 1,000, maybe 1,200 ethnic Germans in Inverclyde at that time. There was certainly double that figure in Liverpool, and more again the East End of London. Again, in Greenock, Liverpool and East End were the three main sugar refinery places for Great Britain, and that involved Abraham Lyle, who was from Greenock, so workers would move around there. As far as we know, it was pretty bad work, really difficult and quite dangerous. So essentially the sugar refineries were often mostly full of Germans and Irish workers as well. In the 19th century, Germans were described as being masters of sugar baking, and it was almost kind of considered like a sort of hidden art, if you like. And as far as we know, that skill of being sugar refinery and working in that industry became strongly associated with Germans, and probably created a bit of resentment among other workers and other people. But as I say, at that time, the links were so strong between the two countries that nobody really thought much of the fact that there was Germans running these warehouses and bringing over their own workers. When my great-great-grandfather, Bernhard Dietrich Ahlfeld, came to Scotland, he settled here with his brother, Karl Heinrich Ahlfeld, and they lived in Ann Street in Greenock. But Karl Heinrich went on to America, and we knew all this from a sort of oral tradition and speaking to our grandparents, but again, years later we were able to make contact with his family in the States, and it was interesting because we could share the same stories, and they knew the same things about the family history as we did. And we'd had been aware that one of the brothers in Germany had been a Lutheran pastor, and they were able to confirm this, and they'd actually managed to get hold of a book of sermons they'd written and sent me a copy of it. You know, so it's something actually kind of, I feel like, proves you know, stories you already knew, and it's something physical you can touch from that period. So it's really good to have, you know. My great-grandfather, or great-great-grandfather, sorry, I should say, came here really because his father, Herman Ahlfeld, had died, and and their mother, Anna Margarita Feldman, had remarried a man called Franz Augustus Riesenhausen, and he essentially got, I mean, they were tenant farmers, probably by Scottish standards crofters, and this stepfather essentially got the property. And the story is that the boys didn't like the stepfather and ran away to sea. And again, this was all essentially folklore until we actually managed to find the wicked stepfather's grave and then see that this was a real, tangible person and these stories were actually real. So they ran away to sea, and the entry point was usually Hull, and you could make your way to Liverpool, Greenock or Plaistow in the East End of London, which is where Germans were settling. Really, they would start in the sugar warehouse, but because they grew up along the River Weser, and they weren't too far from Hamburg, essentially these lads were shipwrights, so they could work with wood as well. I mean, woodcraft and carpentry, again, is strongly associated with Germans. It looks as if neither my great-great-grandfather or his brother spent any great time in the sugar warehouse. They were there for a couple of years and very, very quickly were able to find work in the shipyards. By the turn of the century, when we look at the census, or 1902 actually, the 1902 census, they seem to have managed to acquire a house servant. So things have moved quite quickly for them as far as social standing. They've married, they've got children, but generally, any immigrants coming to Greenock at that time, there's not massive information of any really serious, you describe as persecution. I think we need to look at it in the context of there's no really an issue with Germany at that time, and even these people were a mixture of Lutherans and Catholics, but even Jewish immigrants coming from the German Empire at that time, who were based down at Cathcart Square, that area, they don't record too many instances of persecution. So life doesn't appear to be particularly difficult. The only risk is if the sugar industry seems to be particularly dangerous. There's a few documented cases of people falling into vats of sugar and things like that and being boiled alive and stuff. So it was dangerous work, but then a lot of work was dangerous at that time. But generally, they seem to have graduated into working in the shipyards and doing quite well that way. I think from what we understand, the cost of the transportation was bonded, you know, so you really had to work off your passage, as did Scots going to Canada, as did Scots going to Australia. You know, you had to work up your passage, but essentially after that, they were kind of free agents. Most of them tried to get out, but certainly it looks like an outsider's. The actual working in the refineries looked like an outsider's job. Essentially shipwrights, one or two, again, things more so less so in Greenock and more so in the East End, the bakeries and things like that, and butchers. Germans would take up those industries, which are again were associated with them. I mean, when the First World War rolled round, the anti-German riots nearly stopped bread production in London because most of the bakers were German in origin. They smashed up the shops and destroyed the mills, and obviously caused a problem with supply. But there doesn't seem to be much of that here. I mean, as I say, we're talking maybe about 1,000 people maximum. But the first thing of trouble was probably the Boer War, the Second Boer War actually, and after the siege of Mafeking with Baden-Powell, there was a few attacks on Germans then, because essentially the Kaiser supported the Boers. And so Germans were then seen as Boer sympathisers, kind of in the way prejudice exists today. You know, for conflicts in Iraq or Afghanistan, and people automatically assume Muslims are the same. That kind of thing went on then as well. It's just interesting how these patterns continue. Germans, from what we can see, coming to Greenock, and again, my own family seem to come mostly from the northern part. There's an area around Oldenburg, which essentially was kind of ruled by the princes of Denmark. If you look at something like the Duke of Edinburgh's family tree, he's sort of Danish German, and he's essentially still of the House of Oldenburg. and they were a small principality who managed to marry into the Danish crown. So it was almost like a little principality. Mecklenburg-Vorpommern was a little part of Sweden. These were little kingdoms. Germany, as we see it now, a modern industrial country, didn't exist. It was little pockets of principalities, all with their own little rulers. So it really, who defined religion and culture and things like that. That was maybe useful later on because you know, I'd aunts and people in the family would go, if anyone asks, just say you're Danish. And certainly, you know, between the borders of Europe change so often. Like Schleswig-Holstein is the bit it sits right between Denmark and Germany, and that border has been moving constantly. And that's the same, you know, down at the bottom between Strasbourg in France and Germany. The borders changed so much, and what the people were. So people could slip under the radar with that. Generally, you know, I can remember being told, "Oh, I think we might be Dutch," and even now, I can usually see names and people say. I mean, John Betjeman, the famous poet, always described himself as being British Dutch, and he was an ethnic German. Tolkien was an ethnic German. You know, Hans Holbein. I mean, Handel. These people had a massive influence on British society, and they were all Germans. But yeah, I mean, that map of Europe gives you a good indication of just how feudal that part of Europe was at the time, and how, you know, how many splits there were around the different sort of ethnic identities, if you like. You know, certainly I know a few cases of people interred in the First World War. It really depended on what they classed you. By that time, my great grandfather who was grown up, and the way out of it was to join up and prove your loyalty. It looks to me like people with German second names in Guruk and Greenock essentially joined up. So there's a family story of essentially my great grandfather being in the Argyll and Southern Highlanders, Herman Ahlfeld, and fighting against his own family, who obviously were fighting for the Kaiser in the Prussian army. And there's a sort of mythological family picture we've never tracked down of the two of them after the war. Both survived the war. There's a story, and that's not an unusual story. There was so many ethnic Germans who initially came to Greenock and been moved to the East End by Abraham Lyle when Tate and Lyle merged, that they actually formed a battalion called the Kaiser's Own. So there's this sarcastically named Kaiser's Own battalion in the Middlesex battalion during the First World War, and it's guys called Sherman and things like that, and Ritter and all these German names who fought bravely and were rewarded for it, and riflemen usually. But the Second World War, even though it's a later period, and these people have now either went to America or moved on, you would think it would be a bit easier, but actually probably get worse. The Second World War seems to be worse. My grandfather's brother, Bernhard, was interred, and again the same thing happened to him. He ended up joining up and was decorated. That was generally how it happened before the war broke out. He was questioned, but my grandfather and any of the brothers who had Scottish names like Harry, you know, Robert was my grandfather. They weren't questioned, so somebody somewhere must have been looking at a file. It was the older boys who were named after their forefathers, Bernhard and Herman, but they essentially joined up. There was also a few cases of people with German names not getting interred in the Isle of Man, but getting refused to join up and told they were essential labour. So it seemed very, very haphazard. You know, it was a very haphazard way of dealing with the problem. You know, it was a difficult thing to prove because, as I say, a lot of people could just say, well, you know, I'm Dutch or I'm Danish or I'm Norwegian or I'm actually Swedish or I was born in Poland, because, you know, essentially who was German, who wasn't. You're talking about people whose forebears immigrated in the middle of the 19th century, so it's a long time to get to 1910. But probably the most obvious thing to do is to do what the House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha done and change their name to Windsor. I mean, essentially the Queen today's second name is Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. She just changed her name as they had to do. They did it overnight. The House of Battenberg became the Mountbattens. They all had to do that, and so did plenty of people here. I think if you had time, you'll find plenty of Smiths that were Schmidts and Millers that were Mullers. You know, if people wanted to do that, but I don't know if there's much value in going out and outing people as you know, as ethnic Germans, but certainly that went on. It's worth mentioning how easy it was for people to integrate. I mean, Germany is generally associated with meats and sausages and things like that, and everything's boiled. But that's a kind of stereotype. It's more of an Alpine tradition. You've got to remember these people came from the North Sea coast, and their consumption of herring was pretty severe. And if you ever visit even Holland or Belgium, you know, and lobscouse and things like that, and boiled, various pickled types of herring and mackerel and things like that. The dietary sort of traditions of people from North Germany wasn't a million miles away from people living on the Clyde at that time. Even some of the language they used, because it was so rural, where they're coming from village to village, the dialects could change. Some people came from right on the top of the coast, up near Bremerhaven, and they would speak maybe Friesk, which is a Frisian dialect. And people in that part, at the top of Holland and parts of Denmark, all on that Frisian coast, could speak Low Saxon. Was a word which wasn't a million miles away from Scots. I mean, the words like baw and heed and coo are all words that you'll hear. You know, it could be heard in these essentially North German dialects. So there wasn't really, integration wasn't a massive problem. I mean, the industry was the same, the trades were the same. You know, the people were people, and that's probably the main, you know, the thing that's it's interesting about it now, that even though things departed between the two countries and the relationship kind of broke down, it's a reminder that, you know, people will get on regardless of their background. You know, that's the kind of main thing. But essentially, they all kind of married and settled in very quick. It seems to be probably from point of immigration. Certainly, you know, they went to the point where someone would work maybe for a year or two in the sugar sheds, and then the sugar industry. Yeah, you could say it was a defined community. Ann Street, places like that. That area, and also down in the Venno, which obviously doesn't exist anymore. If you look through the post office address books, you find them gathered, almost living as a community, and they're backwards and forwards. And guys like Lear Vrida and Mark Cool are, you know, almost like community leaders, and they're organising worship and things like that. And yes, it operates as almost a standalone community for a very brief time. Certainly, you know, within 4 years of being here, my great-great-grandfather Bernhardt's married. He's married a little girl called Sarah Anderson. You know, they're married, they're integrated, and very, very quickly. And essentially, from what I can see, is this is brought down to working class people essentially have more in common, and, you know, regardless of ethnic background and things like that. But there's a very brief period where you could say, yeah, there's an ethnic community living almost isolated, and that are always around the sugar industry, and skills and knowledge and transfer of that knowledge and bringing people into work in the industry. Pay in life's pretty grim at that time, but unemployment doesn't seem to be a massive problem because of the amount of shipbuilding that's going on. So there is an economic need to bring German workers in and Irish workers in to work in something that people aren't particularly mad keen on doing. You know, but probably from a brief period up to about maybe 1900, you could say, yeah, there's a distinct community. It looks to be that on the 1902 census, I think it is, my great-great-grandfather probably can't write in English, but he could speak it. He could speak English within, as far as we know. My grandfather and my great aunts can remember speaking to their grandfather. I mean, they can tell you things, you know, from living memory. And they remember, you know, they remember the man. So it's but generally, if you compare it to maybe other ethnic groups, they seem to integrate extremely quickly, and I think that's down to the things they had in common more than anything else. You know, the culture was the same in the background. You know, there's a few researchers from Germany who you know, when researched it in the past, have put the figure maybe for Scotland total 2,500. As a very close. So, and the lion's shares maybe in Greenock, Glasgow and Edinburgh, but Greenock, you know, you could probably disseminate about 1,000, so that's not a lot of people really. You know, it might panic people are anti-immigration, but 1,000 people is not a lot of people really in a town which was really, you know, you couldn't walk at the turn of the century, you couldn't walk the length of Greenock without hearing Gaelic spoken. I mean, you've still got a lot of people coming down from the Highlands, you've got Irish people coming in, you know, there is a small Jewish community, there's a real mix of people, so, and it's a real industrial place, but I think that's the integrated because, like I say, there's two distinct, there's strong, tangible links with Great Britain and Scotland, you know, at that time. There's places for you to work, there's common bonds there, so integration perhaps might have been a bit easier. It's just, as I say, looking at it in the context of 2 world wars later, maybe gives you a kind of false picture of you know, how it was. I mean, the only thing I would add is that, you know, what's been interesting in you know, again, since you've been able to access records so easily over the last kind of 10 years, it's so easy to get access. I don't think I mentioned really the amount of stuff that was passed on as an oral tradition. Like, people would tell you, like, oh, you know, your great grandfather fought in Argyll and Southern Highlanders in the First World War, but his brother he had another brother that never come over, and he had cousins, and you take that as being almost like folklore. But it's interesting finding records now to back that up. There was you know, things about what they did. The story that my great-great-grandfather ran away to sea because he didn't like his stepfather. It's been interesting finding that out. And generally looking back, we can go back to about 1701, and what's staggering is they seem to be contained in a small pocket of rural Germany on the coast, covering just about the size of maybe Inverclyde, and farmed that land. They seem to be itinerant farmers. Heuermann is the technical term on the records, so on the parish records, which just means hired hand, a hired farmer. And they just seem like people who moved around, itinerant farmers, and this was the way of things, just tenant farmers. Going way back, and it's interesting, you know, hearing these things and then being able to actually find the records. If people are thinking of doing it, or they've got it's so easy to do, especially with Germany, and their archiving their records are fantastic, especially parish records. Really easy to do. But the one thing it does show you is it could almost be, you can almost be reading about crofters in Harris or Lewis, facing the same hardship, whether it's, you know, potato blight, whether it's cholera, whether there's conflict. There's conflict with France. There was wars with Denmark. There was endless conflict. There was endless disease, and you know, people living a rural, whether it was off the sea or off the land, is almost identical to the communities they were coming to. And again, for me, it just throws up the similarities we have in culture, you know, no matter where it is in Europe we're from. You know, it seems to be there were skilled workers who were very knowledgeable, master tradesmen in sugar refinery, and then there was obviously the managers and the owners who were Germans as well. But it was really just, I think, for economic reasons, they bring over their own workers. Essentially, most of the guys working could transfer their skills very quickly, and again, usually they ended up being ship's carpenters. That was generally what they ended up doing. You know, certainly that's the case in my family. You know, essentially because they were from northern Germany, they were Lutherans, and this is quite interesting because when I look back, it's a real mixed bag, and this seems to create problems wherever German immigrants have went in the world, because Germany is a mix of Catholics in the south, Lutherans in the north, but also evangelicals who are more like Calvinists. So there wasn't really a comparative match when you got there, but certainly it was thought that the mid-kirk in Greenock had the look of an evangelical kirk in northern Germany. And if I look at the one in the village of Lemwerder, and it's called the Kirk am Deich, which is basically just church on the dike, right? It looks a bit like the mid-kirk, and certainly my great-grandfather married Sarah Anderson there. There probably wasn't a Lutheran church they could go to. We seem to think there was somewhere in Glasgow that Germans gathered for worship, and there was one Lutheran pastor. But what is more interesting is at least half a dozen German Catholic priests came to Scotland, and quite a few in Inverclyde around about that time as well. It was thought, some people used to think that it was a mission to sugar bakers, but it wasn't really. At that time, there was conflict between the Catholics in the south and Bismarck, the German Chancellor, and it was a period called the Kulturkampf, where culture war where the Prussians wanted to push out the influence of the Catholic Church. So a lot of German priests were evacuated here as well to escape persecution. There was one at St Ninian's in Gourock, Bader Hilgers, and he seems to be quite a popular priest and built the parish house that's there now. There was one in Greenock as well, Manfred Kuhler. So there was a few priests dotted about. There was a priest, Father Janssen, up in Coatbridge. So there seems to be quite a lot of German priests, some from Holland as well, and a couple of Belgians, and they come at the same time, which is quite interesting. And again, it's almost kind of bucks the idea that predominantly the Catholic Church re-established itself in the west coast of Scotland through Ireland, which is predominantly true. But just like immigration of people, there seems to be quite a few German priests settled here as well, and some French, got a French priest as well. You know, so that's quite interesting as well. They seem to have made contact, and they seem to have made contact with the sugar bakers and provided some, you know, help to them while they were there. I think, and from what I can, regardless of what their group was, but Germans always seem to be a kind of mix of almost three different, you know, evangelical and mainstream Lutheran and Catholic as well, depending on, again, which principality and where they came from. Rhineland was predominantly Catholic, parts of Dresden were Catholic, the north was evangelical, central Hanover was Lutheran. It just depends on where you came from, and that might have been, sometimes I always think that may have been a barrier to distinct kind of, here's one distinct community, because things were revolved very strongly around faith, you know. I think they would just again integrate into whatever the tradition was. Generally because there was a lot of Irish people working in the sugar warehouses, because it was, you know, it was pretty low paid and pretty difficult work, and a lot of the good jobs are gone. It was essentially an immigrant's job, especially around Sugar House Lane, around the warehouses. Naturally, a lot of Irish people and German people would get together, which is essentially the case in my own family history. You know, and they would take on that religion. So certainly you can see a lot of people with German second names maybe getting the second, third generation who are maybe confessing Catholics, or confessing that faith, and that's just through marrying in. Some, you know, Church of Scotland. Church of Scotland seems to be closest to the sort of churches you'll find in northern Germany, because they're essentially kind of Calvinist in tradition. But it looks as if they seem to would integrate into whatever community was there. It's a real mixed bag, you know. One interesting sign is that there's a few jokes around that, like Ann Street never got bombed in the war because Hitler's auntie lived there, and I mean there's always been jokes around. But after the war, you know, if people were identified as being in German, it would have caused them a lot of problems. But I remember getting told that the German Man City goalkeeper Bert Trautmann, who had been a German paratrooper in the Second World War, the good feel he made a couple of appearances at Capello, and the good feeling towards him and people like that kind of helped make things a bit easier for people that were of German extraction living in Britain. And it was just this idea that here's a guy who was a reasonable guy, and people could meet and say, well, you know, there was a war on and people were fighting for their country, you know. That made things a bit easier. And then even heading into the 70s, where IBM's opened and people come from all over the world, and there's another wave of sort of German immigration. You feel like, you know, that I feel has helped people look back at that period and explore it with a bit more ease now, you know.